The fluorescent lights of the Travis County Courthouse cast harsh shadows across the worn marble floors as Jake Morrison adjusted his ill-fitting suit for the 100th time that morning. The fabric scratched against his neck, a constant reminder that this wasn't his world. At 28, Jake had never imagined he'd be sitting at a defendant's table, watching 12 strangers decide whether he'd spend the next decade behind bars. Austin's September heat filtered through the tall windows, making the already suffocating courtroom feel like a pressure cooker. The air conditioning wheezed overhead, struggling against the Texas humidity that seemed to seep through every crack in the building. Jake could smell the coffee from the courthouse cafeteria mixing with the scent of old wood polish and fear, a combination that would forever remind him of this moment. His court-appointed attorney, Sarah Chen, shuffled through papers with practiced efficiency. She was younger than Jake had expected, maybe 35, with kind eyes that had seen too many cases like his. Her black hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore a navy blazer that looked like it had been pressed that morning. Despite her professional demeanor, Jake could see the exhaustion in the way she held her shoulders, the slight tremor in her hands as she organized her notes. "Remember what we discussed," Sarah whispered, leaning close enough that Jake could smell her lavender perfume. "Tell them about your mother, about why you felt you had no choice. But don't make excuses. Show remorse. Show that you understand what you did was wrong." Jake nodded, his throat tight. 3 months ago, he would have laughed if someone told him he'd be facing armed robbery charges. 3 months ago, he was still playing guitar on South Congress Bridge, earning just enough to help with his mother's medical bills while working double shifts at Rodriguez Construction. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who'd spent years building things was now being torn down by his own desperate choices. The prosecution's case had been straightforward and damning. On June 15th, Jake Morrison had entered Pete's Corner Store on East 6th Street with a kitchen knife, demanded $347 from the register, and fled on foot. The security cameras had captured everything in grainy black and white, his face clearly visible, his hands shaking as he held the knife, his voice cracking as he apologized to the terrified clerk. District Attorney Robert Harrison stood to address the jury, his silver hair catching the courtroom lights. At 55, Harrison had built his career on tough-on-crime rhetoric, and this case was exactly the kind of clear-cut conviction that boosted his statistics. His charcoal suit was impeccably tailored, his posture commanding as he approached the jury box. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrison began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "The facts of this case are not in dispute. On the evening of June 15th, the defendant made a choice. He chose to arm himself with a weapon. He chose to enter an establishment where an innocent man was simply trying to make an honest living. He chose to threaten violence to steal money that didn't belong to him." Jake watched the jurors' faces as Harrison spoke. They were a mix of Austin residents, a retired teacher with silver hair and reading glasses perched on her nose, a young tech worker whose attention kept drifting to his phone, a middle-aged woman who owned a small bakery on the east side, a construction foreman whose calloused hands reminded Jake of his own before everything fell apart. "The defendant wants you to believe that his circumstances justify his actions," Harrison continued, pacing in front of the jury box with measured steps. "That desperation gives someone the right to terrorize an innocent person. But if we accept that logic, where does it end? Do we excuse every crime committed by someone facing hardship? Do we tell law-abiding citizens that their safety matters less than someone else's financial problems?" The prosecutor's words hit Jake like physical blows. Each point was accurate, each argument reasonable. He had terrorized Pete Kowalski, the 60-year-old store owner who'd immigrated from Poland 30 years earlier, and built his small business through decades of 16-hour days. Jake could still see the fear in Pete's eyes, the way his hands shook as he opened the register, the quiet, "Please don't hurt me," that Jake heard in his nightmares. Sarah had warned him about this part. "They'll paint you as a predator," she'd said during one of their preparation meetings in the courthouse's cramped conference room. Harrison's good at making people forget the human being sitting at that table. We need to remind them that you're more than the worst thing you've ever done. But listening to Harrison's methodical destruction of his character, Jake wondered if there was anything left to salvage. The man describing his actions sounded like a stranger, a calculating criminal who'd weighed his options and chosen violence. The reality had been far messier. A desperate son watching his mother waste away, bills piling up like autumn leaves, and a moment of panic that changed everything. Jake's mind drifted to that night 3 months ago. His mother, Linda Morrison, had been lying in her hospital bed at St. Hume, David's medical center. Her once vibrant red hair now thin and gray against the white pillows. The cancer had taken everything: her strength, her appetite, her ability to smile without effort. But her medical bills were taking everything else. $87,000, the billing coordinator had said that afternoon, her voice professionally sympathetic, but ultimately unmoved. The insurance covered what they could, but the experimental treatment— "Mr. Morrison, we need to discuss a payment plan." Jake had stared at the number on the paper until the digits blurred together. $87,000 might as well have been $8 million. His construction job paid decent money, but after rent, groceries, and his mother's basic care, he was lucky to save $50 a month. At that rate, he'd need over 100 years to pay off what they owed. "Mr. Morrison," the coordinator had continued, "I know this is overwhelming, but we have options. There are programs for patients in your situation. Programs that would take months to process while his mother needed treatment immediately." Jake had nodded and smiled, collected the paperwork, and driven to Pete's corner store in a haze of desperation and rage at a world that seemed designed to punish people for being poor. The knife had belonged to his mother's kitchen, a simple utility blade she'd used to cut vegetables for Sunday dinners when she was still strong enough to cook. Jake had grabbed it without thinking, driven by some primitive instinct that money was the solution, and Pete's register contained money. The logic made sense in his panicked mind. A few minutes of terror in exchange for his mother's life. But terror was exactly what he'd inflicted. Pete had been restocking cigarettes behind the counter when Jake entered, humming along to an old country song playing on the radio. The store smelled like coffee and cleaning supplies, with undertones of the breakfast burritos Pete sold to construction workers heading to job sites. It was a familiar, comforting space that Jake had visited hundreds of times over the years. "Evening, Jake," Pete had said without looking up. "How's your mama doing?" That simple kindness had almost broken Jake's resolve. Pete knew his mother was sick. Pete had asked about her recovery every time Jake bought groceries or cigarettes. Pete had even mentioned that his own wife had beaten cancer 5 years earlier, offering hope and encouragement to a young man he barely knew. She's not good, Pete," Jake had managed, his hand closing around the knife handle in his jacket pocket. "I'm sorry to hear that," Pete had replied, finally turning around. His weathered face had shown genuine concern until he saw Jake's expression, the wild look in his eyes, the way his body was coiled with tension. What happened next lasted less than 3 minutes, but would define the rest of Jake's life. The knife, shaking in his inexperienced hands. Pete's frightened compliance as he opened the register. The pathetic amount of cash, $347, that wouldn't even cover 1 day of his mother's treatment. Jake's stumbling apology as he backed toward the door. Pete's whispered plea not to hurt anyone else. And then the run through Austin's humid night, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. The knife discarded in a dumpster 3 blocks away, the money burning in his pocket like radioactive material. By the time he reached his truck, Jake was sobbing with shame and terror, knowing he'd crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The police had found him 2 days later at the construction site, handcuffing him in front of his co-workers while he knelt in the red Texas dirt. His supervisor, Miguel Santos, had shaken his head with disappointment rather than surprise. "Man, why didn't you just ask for help?" Miguel had said. "We all knew your mama was sick. We could have figured something out." But pride and desperation had made asking for help impossible. Jake had been raised to solve his own problems, to work harder when life got difficult. His father had died when Jake was 16, leaving him as the man of the house responsible for his mother's well-being. Asking for charity felt like admitting failure, like betraying the values his parents had instilled in him. Now, sitting in the courtroom while Harrison painted him as a predator, Jake realized how catastrophically wrong he'd been. His mother had visited him once in jail, her frail body dwarfed by the plastic chair in the visiting room. She'd cried when she saw him in the orange jumpsuit, her tears mixing with his as they spoke through bulletproof glass. "I'm so sorry, Mama," he'd whispered, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "I know, baby," she'd replied, pressing her palm against the glass. "I know you are, but sorry doesn't undo what you did. That poor man. Jake, how could you scare someone like that?" She'd been right, of course. Pete Kowalski hadn't deserved to fear for his life because Jake Morrison couldn't figure out how to save his mother through legal means. The $347 had been returned, but the trauma couldn't be undone. Pete had started closing his store earlier, installed additional security cameras, and begun taking anxiety medication to sleep at night. Sarah Chen rose to present the defense's opening statement, her heels clicking against the worn courthouse floor. She was an experienced public defender who'd handled hundreds of cases like Jake's. Desperate people making terrible choices in impossible circumstances. But she also knew that sympathy only went so far with juries who wanted to feel safe in their community. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the challenging case she faced. "What Jake Morrison did was wrong. He knows it was wrong. He's not asking you to excuse his actions or pretend they didn't happen. What he's asking for is the chance to explain how a good man made a terrible mistake, and what led him to that moment of desperation." She moved closer to the jury box, her expression earnest and direct. "Over the next few days, you're going to hear about Jake's life before that night in June. You'll learn about a young man who lost his father as a teenager and worked 2 jobs to help support his mother. A man who played music on the streets of Austin, not for fame or fortune, but to earn a few extra dollars for his mother's medical care. A man who'd never committed so much as a traffic violation before the night desperation drove him to make the worst decision of his life." Jake watched the jurors' faces, searching for any sign of sympathy or understanding. The retired teacher seemed to soften slightly, her expression thoughtful rather than condemning. The bakery owner nodded almost imperceptibly, perhaps understanding the weight of financial pressure on a small business. But others remained stone-faced, their judgment already forming. "Jake Morrison is not a career criminal," Sarah continued. "He's not a violent man. He's a son who watched his mother dying and felt the entire world closing in around him. That doesn't excuse what he did to Mr. Kowalski, but it might help you understand how someone with no history of violence could make such a desperate choice." The morning wore on with witness testimony and evidence presentation. Pete Kowalski took the stand, his thick Polish accent making his words even more heartbreaking as he described the robbery. He was a small man, maybe 5'6", with calloused hands and kind eyes that kept darting nervously toward Jake. "I know Jake since he was maybe 20 years old," Pete testified, his voice barely audible in the hushed courtroom. "Good boy, always polite, always ask about his mother. That night, I see something different in his eyes, something scared and angry. I think maybe he hurt me. Maybe he desperate enough to do something bad." Harrison questioned Pete with surgical precision, drawing out details that emphasized Jake's threatening behavior and Pete's genuine fear. The knife, even though Jake had never intended to use it, had seemed enormous in Pete's memory. The demand for money had sounded like a death threat. The entire experience had left Pete questioning his decision to keep the store open late, wondering if every customer might be the next person to victimize him. "Has this incident changed how you operate your business?" Harrison asked. Pete nodded sadly. "I close early now. 6 o'clock, not 9 like before. I put more cameras, more lights. My wife, she worry every day I go to work. She say maybe we should sell the store, move somewhere safer. But this is America, you know? This is supposed to be a safe place to work hard and build something." Jake felt each word like a physical wound. Pete's American dream had been tarnished by Jake's moment of desperation. Another layer of damage that couldn't be quantified in dollar amounts or jail sentences. The prosecution's case continued with clinical efficiency. Security footage showed Jake entering and leaving the store, his face clearly visible despite the poor video quality. The store clerk, who'd found Pete shaking behind the counter, testified about calling 911. Police officers described the investigation that led to Jake's arrest. Each witness added another brick to the wall of evidence that would likely send Jake to prison. As the afternoon sun slanted through the courthouse windows, painting everything in shades of amber and regret, Jake found himself thinking about music. Before his mother got sick, before the bills piled up, before desperation drove him to crime, music had been his refuge. He'd learned to play guitar from his grandfather, a gentle man who'd worked the oil fields in East Texas and came home each evening to play folk songs on the front porch. "Music tells the truth when words ain't enough," his grandfather used to say, his weathered fingers finding melodies that seemed to capture everything beautiful and broken about life in small-town Texas. Don't matter if you're rich or poor, happy or sad. The right song can reach inside someone's chest and remind them they ain't alone in this world. Jake had carried that philosophy to Austin's streets, playing for tourists and locals alike. His guitar case had collected crumpled dollar bills and occasional $20 notes from people who stopped to listen. It wasn't much money, but it had felt honest, earned through beauty rather than desperation, through connection rather than intimidation. The courthouse began to empty as the day's proceedings concluded. Sarah gathered her papers, while Jake sat in stunned silence, the weight of testimony pressing down on him like Austin's summer humidity. Tomorrow would bring more witnesses, more evidence, more reasons why Jake Morrison deserved to be locked away from civilized society. "How do you think it went?" Jake asked, as the bailiff prepared to escort him back to his cell. Sarah's pause told him everything he needed to know. "It's early yet," she said diplomatically. "Tomorrow we start presenting your side of the story. The jury needs to see you as a human being, not just a defendant." But as Jake shuffled out of the courtroom in his shackles, he wondered if there was enough humanity left in him to salvage. The man who'd once played music for strangers on Austin bridges seemed like someone he'd known in another lifetime, before desperation had taught him that good intentions meant nothing when survival was at stake. The Travis County Jail's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Jake lay on his narrow bunk that night, staring at the ceiling and thinking about melodies he'd never play again. Somewhere in the city, Pete Kowalski was probably having nightmares about the scared young man who'd threatened him with a kitchen knife. Somewhere else, Jake's mother was lying in a hospital bed. her medical bills still unpaid despite her son's crime. And tomorrow, 12 strangers would continue deciding whether Jake Morrison deserved a chance at redemption or if some mistakes were simply too big to forgive. The weight of that question pressed down on him as Austin settled into another humid night, full of dreams deferred and second chances that might never come. Dawn crept through the courthouse windows like a reluctant witness, casting long shadows across the empty hallways where Jake Morrison's fate would be decided. The second day of trial brought a different energy. The initial shock of criminal proceedings had worn off, replaced by the methodical rhythm of legal strategy and human judgment. Jake's mother, Linda Morrison, had insisted on attending despite her weakened condition. She sat in the gallery's front row, her once vibrant frame now fragile in a blue dress she'd worn to church before the cancer took away her strength for Sunday services. Her presence filled Jake with both comfort and crushing guilt. Every labored breath she took was a reminder of why he'd committed the crime and why it had been so catastrophically wrong. Sarah Chen had prepared Jake for this phase of the trial with the thoroughness of someone who understood that second chances were rarely given, only fought for and won through careful preparation. In the courthouse's cramped conference room, surrounded by law books that smelled like old leather and broken dreams, she'd coached Jake on how to tell his story without sounding like he was making excuses. "The jury needs to see the person you were before that night," Sarah had explained, her voice patient despite the impossible task ahead of them. "They need to understand that good people can make terrible choices when they're pushed beyond their limits. But they also need to believe you understand the gravity of what you did." The prosecution's case continued with mechanical precision. Robert Harrison called character witnesses who painted Jake as increasingly desperate in the months leading up to the robbery. Maria Santos, who worked in the billing department at St. David's Medical Center, testified about Jake's frequent visits to discuss payment plans for his mother's treatment. "He became more agitated each time we met," Maria explained, her voice sympathetic but professional. "I could see the stress wearing on him. He'd ask about discounts, about charity care programs, about anything that might reduce the amount owed. But the numbers were just substantial. Even with payment plans, the monthly amounts would have been difficult for someone in his income bracket." Harrison's questioning drew out the specific figures: medical bills totaling $87,000, Jake's monthly income after taxes of approximately $3,000, rent and basic living expenses that consumed most of his paycheck. The math was stark and unforgiving, painting a picture of a young man watching his options disappear with each passing day. Miguel Santos, Jake's former supervisor at Rodriguez Construction, took the stand with obvious reluctance. His work boots had been polished for the occasion, and his usually paint-stained hands were clean. But he looked deeply uncomfortable in the formal courtroom setting. "Jake was a good worker," Miguel testified, his slight accent coloring his words with warmth despite the circumstances. "Never missed a day unless his mother had doctor appointments. Always willing to work overtime, take on the harder jobs that paid a little more. But I could see something eating at him those last few months." "Did he discuss his mother's medical situation with you?" Harrison asked. Miguel nodded. "He mentioned it, yes. Said she was getting expensive treatment, that the bills were piling up. I offered to help. We all did. The guys on the crew, we talked about taking up a collection, maybe organizing a benefit. But Jake, he had pride, you know? He said he could handle it, that he didn't want charity." The testimony painted Jake as increasingly isolated in his desperation, too proud to accept help, but too overwhelmed to manage alone. Harrison used this to reinforce his narrative of a man who chose crime over humility, violence over community support. But when Sarah cross-examined Miguel, a different picture emerged. "In your experience, how long would it take someone in Jake's position to save $87,000. Miguel did the math quickly, his construction background making calculations automatic. At Jake's salary, saving maybe $200–300 a month if he lived real careful, maybe 20–30 years. But that's if nothing else went wrong, if he never had car trouble or got sick himself. And how long did doctors say Jake's mother had without treatment? 6 months, maybe less. The impossibility of Jake's situation hung in the courtroom air like Austin's summer humidity, thick, suffocating, and inescapable. Sarah had made her point without excusing Jake's actions. Sometimes people face choices between impossible and unthinkable. The afternoon brought witnesses for Jake's defense, people who'd known him before desperation transformed him into someone he didn't recognize. Tommy Williams, who managed the South Congress Bridge area where street musicians performed, testified about Jake's reputation among the musical community. Jake was one of the good ones, Tommy explained, his gray ponytail and weathered denim jacket marking him as someone who'd spent decades in Austin's music scene. Never caused trouble, never hassled other musicians for better spots. He'd show up after his construction job, play until dark, then pack up and go home. Kids loved him. He knew all the Disney songs, could make any child stop crying with the right melody. Sarah approached the witness stand with a guitar case, requesting permission to demonstrate Jake's musical abilities. Harrison objected, arguing that musical talent was irrelevant to armed robbery charges. But Judge Patricia Whitman allowed the demonstration after careful consideration. Music was how the defendant earned additional income to support his mother's care, Sarah argued. It shows his character, his attempt to solve his problems through legal means before desperation drove him to crime. Tommy opened the guitar case, Jake's own instrument, held as evidence since his arrest, and tuned it with the practiced ease of someone who'd been around music his entire life. The courtroom fell silent as he strummed a few chords, the sound echoing off the formal walls like something from another world. Jake used to play this song, Tommy said, beginning a gentle melody that Jake recognized as one his grandfather had taught him years ago. Said it reminded him of his granddaddy, of family and hope, and all the things worth working for. The music filled the sterile courtroom with unexpected warmth. Several jurors leaned forward, their expressions softening as the melody washed over them. Even Judge Whitman seemed affected, her stern features relaxing slightly as Tommy's fingers found the familiar chord progressions. But the song also opened wounds in Jake's heart that had never fully healed. Sitting there listening to his grandfather's melody, Jake remembered lazy summer evenings on the front porch in Beaumont, his grandfather's weathered hands guiding Jake's small fingers across the guitar strings. "Every song tells a story, Jake," his grandfather had said, his voice gentle but serious. "Some tell stories about love, some about loss, some about hope when everything seems hopeless. But the best songs, they tell the truth about what it means to be human. All the beautiful and broken parts mixed together." Jake had carried that lesson to Austin streets, playing for tourists who'd pause on their way to trendy restaurants and locals who recognized something authentic in his simple melodies. The money had been secondary to the connection. The way music could bridge the gap between strangers and remind everyone that they shared common dreams and fears. Linda Morrison wiped tears from her eyes as Tommy played, remembering the nights Jake would come home from his construction job exhausted, but still find energy to play guitar by her hospital bed. Even as the cancer treatments left her weak and nauseous, those moments of music had provided comfort that medication couldn't match. He'd play that same song, she would later testify, her voice barely audible in the hushed courtroom. Said it reminded him that love was stronger than anything else, that music could heal what doctors couldn't touch. Even when I was too sick to talk, those melodies, They helped me remember why fighting was worth it. Sarah's questioning of Linda Morrison was perhaps the most emotionally charged testimony of the trial. Here was a mother dying of cancer, forced to watch her son's life destroyed by his desperate attempt to save her. The irony was devastating. Jake's crime had been motivated by love, but had ultimately caused more pain for the person he'd been trying to protect. "Did you know about Jake's financial struggles?" Sarah asked gently. Linda nodded, her hands trembling slightly from the medication. "I knew the bills were high, but Jake tried to shield me from the worst of it. He'd say not to worry, that he was handling everything. But I could see the stress in his eyes, the way he'd stare at papers when he thought I wasn't looking. If you had known the full extent of the financial pressure he was under, what would you have told him?" "I would have told him to let me go," Linda answered, her voice breaking but firm. "No amount of money is worth what he did to that poor man. No treatment is worth destroying your soul. I raised Jake to be better than that, to find solutions that didn't hurt innocent people." The courtroom fell silent as Linda's words settled over them. Here was a mother's love that prioritized her son's character over her own survival. A wisdom born from watching desperation corrupt the person she'd raised with such care. Harrison's cross-examination of Linda was restrained but effective. He established that she had never asked Jake to commit crimes on her behalf, that she would have preferred to die rather than see him become a criminal. Every question reinforced the prosecution's argument that Jake had chosen crime over other alternatives, that his mother's condition explained his desperation but didn't justify his actions. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah called more character witnesses who painted a picture of Jake as someone who'd spent his life helping others. Neighbors testified about his volunteer work maintaining the community garden in his apartment complex. Former co-workers described his willingness to cover shifts for people dealing with family emergencies. The portrait that emerged was of a fundamentally decent person who'd made a terrible choice in an impossible situation. But the most compelling testimony came from Carmen Rodriguez, a social worker who'd evaluated Jake after his arrest. Her assessment revealed the psychological toll of watching his mother slowly die while feeling powerless to save her. Jake displayed classic symptoms of someone experiencing acute stress and depression. Carmen testified. The weight of responsibility he felt for his mother's care, combined with his financial inability to meet that responsibility, created a psychological pressure that many people couldn't withstand. In your professional opinion, was Jake Morrison's mental state on the night of the robbery consistent with someone making rational, calculated decisions? Sarah asked. No, Carmen replied firmly. His actions that night were consistent with someone in acute psychological distress, someone whose normal decision-making processes had been overwhelmed by impossible circumstances. That doesn't excuse what he did, but it helps explain how someone with no history of violence could make such an uncharacteristic choice. Harrison's cross-examination challenged Carmen's assessment, establishing that many people faced similar pressures without resorting to crime. Stress doesn't give someone the right to terrorize innocent people. Does it, Ms. Rodriguez? No, it doesn't, Carmen agreed. But understanding why people make terrible choices can help us figure out how to prevent those choices in the future. As the second day of trial concluded, Jake felt emotionally drained from hearing his life dissected and analyzed by strangers. The testimony had revealed truths he'd tried to hide even from himself. The depth of his desperation, the weight of responsibility that had crushed his judgment, the way pride and fear had isolated him when he most needed help. That evening in his cell, Jake found himself humming the melody Tommy Williams had played in court. The song his grandfather had taught him so many years ago seemed different now, colored by everything that had happened since those innocent summer evenings in Beaumont. The melody remained the same, but its meaning had deepened with experience and loss. His grandfather had been right about music telling stories. Jake's story had become one of love corrupted by desperation, of good intentions leading to devastating consequences, of a young man who'd tried to save his mother but had ultimately lost himself in the process. The question now was whether that story could have a redemptive ending, whether 12 strangers could find enough mercy to believe that people could change, that mistakes didn't have to define someone forever. Outside his cell window, Austin settled into another humid night. Somewhere in the city, Pete Kowalski was probably still struggling with anxiety and fear. Somewhere else, Linda Morrison was fighting a battle against cancer that no amount of money could win. And in courtrooms across America, other desperate people were learning that justice and mercy didn't always arrive hand in hand, that sometimes the system designed to protect society couldn't distinguish between predators and people who'd simply run out of options. Tomorrow would bring closing arguments and jury deliberation, the final chapter in a story that had begun with love and desperation and might end with either redemption or condemnation. Jake closed his eyes and tried to remember his grandfather's words about songs that told the truth about being human. All the beautiful and broken parts mixed together, waiting for someone to find the melody that made sense of it all. The third day of trial dawned with the oppressive heat that made Austin summers legendary. By 8 a.m., the temperature had already climbed past 80 degrees, and the courthouse's aging air conditioning system wheezed like an old man climbing stairs. Jake Morrison sat at the defendant's table, his palms sweating against the worn wood as he prepared for what could be the most important day of his life. Judge Patricia Whitman had scheduled closing arguments for the morning, followed by jury instructions and the beginning of deliberations. After 2 days of testimony, evidence, and emotional revelations, 12 strangers would retreat to a small room and decide whether Jake deserved punishment or mercy, prison or probation. Robert Harrison stood to deliver his closing argument with the confidence of a prosecutor who'd built his career on cases exactly like this one. His silver hair caught the morning light streaming through the courthouse windows, and his navy suit was pressed to crisp perfection. Everything about his appearance projected competence and authority, qualities that juries found reassuring when they needed to make difficult decisions. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrison began, his voice carrying easily to the back of the courtroom, "over the past 2 days, you've heard a lot of testimony designed to make you feel sympathy for the defendant. His mother's illness, his financial struggles, his apparent good character before the night he chose to become an armed robber. But I want you to remember something as you consider your verdict. Sympathy doesn't change facts, and facts don't lie." Harrison moved to the evidence table, picking up the kitchen knife Jake had used in the robbery. Even in the fluorescent lighting, the blade looked menacing, its ordinary steel transformed into something threatening by the context of violence. This knife was in Jake Morrison's hand when he entered Pete Kowalski's store, Harrison continued, holding the weapon so the jury could see it clearly. Mr. Kowalski, a 60-year-old immigrant who's worked 16-hour days for 30 years to build his small business, saw this knife and feared for his life. That fear was real. That terror was justified. And that victim deserves justice. The prosecutor's words hit Jake like physical blows. Each point was accurate, each argument reasonable. He had terrified an innocent man. He had chosen violence over other alternatives. The sympathy his defense team had worked to generate couldn't change those fundamental facts. The defense wants you to believe that desperation justifies crime, Harrison continued, pacing in front of the jury box with measured steps. That financial pressure excuses armed robbery. That love for his mother somehow makes terrorizing a stranger acceptable. But if we accept that logic, we open the floodgates to chaos. Every person facing hardship becomes a potential criminal. Every law-abiding citizen becomes a potential victim. Sarah Chen took notes while Harrison spoke, preparing her own closing argument that would need to acknowledge Jake's guilt, while somehow convincing the jury that mercy was more appropriate than maximum punishment. She'd handled hundreds of cases like this, desperate people making terrible choices, but each one still broke her heart a little. Jake Morrison had options, Harrison declared, his voice rising slightly for emphasis. He could have asked for help from co-workers who testified they would have assisted him. He could have applied for the charity programs offered by the hospital. He could have swallowed his pride and accepted community support. Instead, he chose the easy way. Take what he wanted by force. Let someone else pay the price for his problems. The prosecutor's characterization of robbery as the easy way struck Jake as fundamentally wrong. Nothing about that night had been easy. Every second in Pete's store had felt like an eternity of moral agony. The weight of the knife in his hand had been crushing. The look of fear in Pete's eyes had haunted Jake's dreams for months. But Harrison wasn't interested in Jake's internal struggle. His job was to represent society's need for safety and order, to ensure that crimes had consequences regardless of the criminal's motivations. From that perspective, Jake Morrison was a dangerous person who'd chosen violence when faced with adversity. Exactly the kind of individual who needed to be removed from the community for everyone else's protection. The defendant had never committed a violent crime before, Harrison acknowledged, addressing one of the defense's key arguments. But that doesn't mean he's not dangerous. It means he's crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. He's shown that when pressured, he responds with violence. He's demonstrated that his problems are more important to him than other people's safety. That makes him a threat to every person in this community who might have something he wants. Jake watched the jurors' faces as Harrison spoke. Some nodded along with the prosecutor's logic. Others looked troubled by the harsh characterization. The retired teacher who'd seemed sympathetic during Sarah's opening kept glancing at Jake with an expression he couldn't read. Disappointment, maybe, or sadness at the waste of a young life. Harrison's closing argument lasted 45 minutes, methodically dismantling every excuse the defense had offered while reinforcing the simple facts. Jake Morrison had committed armed robbery. He had terrorized an innocent person. He deserved to be punished to the full extent of the law. The prosecutor's final words echoed in the courtroom like a death sentence. Justice isn't about feeling good, Harrison concluded. Justice is about consequences. Jake Morrison made his choice on the night of June 15th. Now it's time for him to face the consequences of that choice. I trust that you'll deliver the verdict this community needs. Guilty on all charges, with a sentence that reflects the seriousness of armed robbery and the need to protect law-abiding citizens from dangerous criminals. Sarah Chen rose for her closing argument, knowing she faced an almost impossible task. The facts were against her client. The law was against her client. Public sentiment favored punishment over mercy. But she'd learned long ago that impossible cases sometimes produced unexpected victories, that juries could surprise everyone when they saw beyond the crime to the human being who'd committed it. "Members of the jury," Sarah began, her voice steady but emotionally resonant, "Mr. Harrison is right about one thing. Jake Morrison committed armed robbery. He terrorized an innocent man. He made a terrible choice that hurt someone who didn't deserve it. But the question before you today isn't whether Jake committed this crime. He did. The question is what justice looks like for a man who made the worst mistake of his life while trying to save the person he loved most." Sarah moved closer to the jury, her expression earnest and direct. "Jake Morrison isn't asking you to excuse what he did. He's asking you to see the whole person, not just his worst moment. to understand that sometimes good people make terrible choices when they're pushed beyond human endurance. She gestured toward Linda Morrison, sitting frail but determined in the gallery. That woman raised a son who volunteered in community gardens, who covered shifts for co-workers in crisis, who played music for children on Austin's bridges. That son watched her dying and felt the entire weight of the world crushing down on him. It doesn't excuse what he did, but it explains how someone with no history of violence could make such a desperate choice. Jake felt his throat tighten as Sarah spoke. Every word was true, but the truth felt inadequate against the magnitude of what he'd done to Pete Kowalski. How do you balance love against terror, desperation against harm, one moment of terrible judgment against a lifetime of trying to do right? The prosecution wants you to believe that Jake Morrison is dangerous, Sarah continued. But danger implies a pattern, a willingness to hurt others for personal gain. What Jake did was the act of a man at the end of his rope, someone who'd exhausted every legal option and watched time running out on his mother's life. The defense attorney's voice grew stronger as she found her rhythm. You heard testimony that Jake had never committed so much as a traffic violation before that night. You heard that co-workers and neighbors described him as helpful, kind, reliable. You heard that he spent his evenings playing music to earn a few extra dollars for his mother's care, not for himself, not for luxury, but for medicine that might save her life. Sarah paused, letting her words settle over the jury. Mr. Harrison talked about consequences, but Jake Morrison has already faced consequences that no punishment could match. He has to live every day knowing that his moment of desperation failed to save his mother and destroyed his own life. He has to carry the weight of Pete Kowalski's fear, the knowledge that he became someone he never wanted to be. The courtroom was absolutely silent as Sarah approached her conclusion. Even Judge Whitman seemed to lean forward slightly, caught up in the defense attorney's passionate plea for understanding. I'm not asking you to let Jake Morrison walk away without consequences, Sarah said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. I'm asking you to remember that justice and mercy aren't opposites. They're partners. That punishment without hope of redemption serves no one. That sometimes the bravest thing a community can do is believe that people can change. That mistakes don't define us forever. Jake's chest felt tight as Sarah returned to her seat. He wanted to believe her words, wanted to think that redemption was possible for someone who'd made such a terrible choice. But the weight of Pete's terror, his mother's disappointment, and his own self-loathing made hope feel like a luxury he couldn't afford. Judge Whitman began her instructions to the jury, explaining the legal standards they would need to apply, the difference between guilt and innocence, the range of sentences available if they found Jake guilty as charged. Her voice was professional and measured, but Jake thought he detected something softer in her tone, a recognition of the human tragedy playing out in her courtroom. The jury filed out at 11:47 a.m. to begin their deliberations. Jake was escorted back to a holding cell where he would wait, while 12 strangers debated his future. The cell was small and windowless, with concrete walls painted institutional green and a metal bench that was uncomfortable no matter how he positioned himself. Hours passed with excruciating slowness. Sarah visited twice to update Jake on the jury's requests. They wanted to see the security footage again. They asked for testimony to be read back. They requested clarification on sentencing guidelines. Each request felt like tea leaves that might reveal their thinking, but the pattern remained maddeningly unclear. How long do you think they'll take? Jake asked during Sarah's second visit. It's impossible to predict, she replied, though her expression suggested she was analyzing every detail for clues. A quick verdict usually favors the prosecution. The facts are clear. The case seems straightforward. But the longer they deliberate, the more likely they are wrestling with the human elements of your case. At 4:30 p.m., Jake was returned to the courtroom. The jury had reached a verdict after nearly 5 hours of deliberation. The courtroom filled quickly with spectators, court personnel, and media representatives who'd been waiting for the conclusion of a case that had captured local attention. Jake's legs felt unsteady as he stood to hear the verdict. His mother sat in the front row, her face pale but composed. Pete Kowalski was there too, his expression unreadable as he waited to learn whether justice had been served. Sarah stood beside Jake, her hand briefly touching his shoulder in a gesture of support. The jury foreman, a middle-aged man who worked as an accountant, stood with the verdict form in his hands. His face revealed nothing about the hours of debate that had preceded this moment. "Have you reached a verdict?" Judge Whitman asked. "We have, Your Honor." "How do you find the defendant on the charge of armed robbery?" The words that came next would determine whether Jake Morrison had a future or would spend the next decade in prison. But before the foreman could speak, an unexpected sound cut through the courtroom's tense silence. Someone was humming. The melody was soft at first, barely audible above the courthouse's ambient noise, but it grew stronger, more distinct, a haunting folk tune that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the gallery. Jake's head snapped around, his eyes searching the crowd for the source of the music. It was his melody, the song his grandfather had taught him, the one Tommy Williams had played during the trial, the tune that connected Jake to memories of love and hope before desperation had poisoned everything. But the voice wasn't familiar. It was weathered and warm, with the distinctive timbre of someone who'd spent decades singing professionally. The melody filled the formal courtroom like something from another world, transforming the sterile legal proceeding into something more human, more connected to the universal experiences of love and loss that defined all their lives. Jake's throat constricted as he continued humming the song, his voice cracking with emotion and memory. He wasn't even conscious of making the sound. It simply emerged from some deep place inside him where music lived alongside grief, where his grandfather's lessons about beauty and truth had survived even the worst of his mistakes. Judge Whitman raised her gavel to restore order, but before she could bring it down, another voice joined Jake's humming. This one was unmistakable, even to people who'd never heard it in person. It was a voice that had defined American music for over half a century. A voice that belonged to someone who should have been nowhere near a courthouse in Austin, Texas. Willie Nelson stood up from a seat in the back of the courtroom, his iconic braids visible even from a distance. His weathered face creased with an expression Jake couldn't interpret. The country music legend had been sitting quietly in the gallery, apparently attending the trial for reasons no one could fathom. "I know that song," Willie said, his voice carrying easily through the stunned courtroom. "Haven't heard it in maybe 40 years, but I know every note. My old friend Waylon used to play it back when we were all young and broke and thought music could save the world." The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps as people recognized the legendary musician. Judge Whitman's gavel came down repeatedly, but even she seemed too shocked by Willie's presence to immediately restore order. "Your Honor," Willie continued, stepping forward with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention, "I know this isn't my place, and I apologize for interrupting. But that boy's singing a song my mentor taught me when I was just starting out. It's about redemption, about finding your way back to the light when you've lost yourself in darkness. I think maybe this courtroom needs to hear the whole thing." The interruption was completely unprecedented. Nothing in Judge Whitman's decades on the bench had prepared her for a situation where Willie Nelson appeared in her courtroom and requested to perform during jury deliberations. But something in his manner, in the reverent way he spoke about the song, made her pause. "Mr. Nelson," she said carefully, "while I appreciate your interest in these proceedings, this is highly irregular. We're in the middle of receiving a jury verdict." "I understand that, Your Honor," Willie replied, his voice respectful but determined. "But sometimes irregular is exactly what the situation requires. That young man up there isn't just humming a tune. He's reaching for something his granddaddy taught him about finding hope in hopeless places. And if I'm not mistaken, this whole courtroom could use a reminder about what redemption sounds like." Sarah Chen looked between Willie, the judge, and her client with an expression that suggested she was questioning her own sanity. This was either the best thing that could happen to Jake's case or a complete disaster that would overshadow everything they'd built during the trial. But Jake wasn't thinking about legal strategy or courtroom procedure. He was thinking about his grandfather, about the man who'd taught him that music could tell truths when words weren't enough. And somehow, Willie Nelson, a legend Jake had grown up listening to, had recognized the same melody, had understood its meaning in a way that transcended the formal boundaries of legal proceedings. "Your Honor," Jake said, his voice barely audible, but somehow carrying to every corner of the courtroom. "I know I don't have the right to ask for anything, but if Mr. Nelson knows this song, if he understands what it means, maybe everyone should hear it the way my granddaddy intended." Judge Whitman looked around her courtroom, at the stunned jury, the fascinated spectators, the defendant who just requested that Willie Nelson perform during his trial. In 30 years on the bench, she'd never faced a situation remotely like this one. But she'd also never presided over a case that had touched her quite the way Jake Morrison's story had. The young man's desperation, his mother's love, his grandfather's music, it all pointed toward something larger than legal procedure, something about the human capacity for both terrible mistakes and unexpected grace. "Mr. Nelson," Judge Whitman said finally, "if you believe this song is relevant to the proceedings, and if all parties consent, I'll allow you to share it with the court." Willie nodded gratefully and moved toward the front of the courtroom. Someone, Jake never learned who, handed him a guitar from somewhere in the gallery. As Willie tuned the instrument with the practiced ease of someone who'd been playing for 7 decades, the courtroom fell into complete silence. "This song," Willie said, his voice carrying the weight of years and experience, "was written by a man named Jimmy Phillips back in the 1940s. He was a drifter, a drunk, someone who'd made every mistake a person could make. But he found something in music that he couldn't find anywhere else, a way to tell the truth about being broken and still believe in the possibility of healing." Willie's fingers found the opening chords, and suddenly the courtroom was filled with music that seemed to transform the very air they breathed. His voice, weathered by decades of hard living and honest singing, gave the melody a depth that Jake had never imagined possible. The song told a story of a man who'd lost his way, who'd hurt people he loved, who'd made choices that seemed to define him as beyond redemption. But it also told of hope that persisted, even in the darkest places, of love that survived even the worst mistakes, of the possibility that people could change if they were given the chance. As Willie sang, Jake felt something shifting inside his chest. Not absolution, because what he'd done to Pete Kowalski couldn't be undone, but a sense that maybe his story didn't have to end with that one terrible night. Maybe there was still a chance to become someone his grandfather would be proud of, someone worthy of the music that had shaped his earliest understanding of right and wrong. The jury listened with expressions ranging from amazement to tears. Several members seemed visibly moved by Willie's performance, by the way the song seemed to speak directly to Jake's situation. Even Pete Kowalski appeared affected, his stern expression softening as the music filled the space between victim and perpetrator, with something approaching understanding. When Willie finished, the courtroom remained silent for a long moment. The song's final notes seemed to hang in the air like a question. What do we do with people who've made terrible mistakes, but still carry the capacity for good? "Thank you, Mr. Nelson," Judge Whitman said quietly. "That was illuminating." Willie nodded and returned to his seat, leaving behind an atmosphere that felt fundamentally different from what had existed before his impromptu performance. The formal legal proceeding had been transformed into something more human, more connected to the messy realities of love and loss, and the possibility of redemption. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Judge Whitman said, "given this unusual interruption, I'm going to ask if you need additional time to deliberate." The jury foreman looked at his fellow jurors, saw some nodding, others shaking their heads. After a brief whispered conference, he turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, we'd like to hear from the defendant. Not testimony, just we'd like him to tell us what that song means to him, what his grandfather taught him about music, and what he's learned from all of this." It was another unprecedented request, but Judge Whitman was beginning to realize that precedent might not be the most important consideration in a case that had already defied every expectation. After consulting with both attorneys, she allowed Jake to address the jury directly. Jake stood on unsteady legs, his mind racing as he tried to find words for everything he was feeling. The courtroom was absolutely silent, waiting for him to explain how a song could possibly matter in the face of armed robbery and shattered lives. "My granddaddy taught me that song when I was 8 years old," Jake began, his voice shaking but growing stronger with each word. He said it was about a man who'd lost his way, but found it again through music and love, and people who believed he could be better than his worst moment. He paused, looking at Pete Kowalski in the gallery. "I lost my way that night in your store, Mr. Kowalski. I became someone I didn't recognize, someone who could scare a good man just trying to make an honest living. The song doesn't excuse what I did. Nothing excuses what I did. But it reminds me that maybe that night doesn't have to be the end of my story." Jake's voice broke as he continued, "My mama's probably going to die from her cancer. The money I stole didn't save her. It just made everything worse. But if I get a second chance, if this community believes I can be better than that one terrible choice, then maybe I can spend the rest of my life making sure that what happened to Mr. Kowalski never happens to anyone else." He turned back to the jury, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I can't undo what I did. I can't give Mr. Kowalski back his sense of safety, or my mama back her pride in the son she raised. But I can promise that if you give me the chance, I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of the music my granddaddy taught me. Music about redemption, about second chances, about the possibility that even broken people can find their way back to the light." The courtroom remained silent as Jake sat down. His words hung in the air alongside the memory of Willie Nelson's performance, creating an atmosphere unlike anything anyone present had ever experienced in a legal proceeding. After another brief conference, the jury foreman announced they were ready to deliver their verdict. But as he stood with the paper in his hands, it was clear that Willie's interruption and Jake's response had fundamentally changed the nature of what was about to happen. The verdict, when it came, would be about more than guilt or innocence. It would be about whether a community could find room for mercy alongside justice, whether second chances were possible for people who'd made unforgivable mistakes, whether music and love and the possibility of redemption could matter as much as law and order in determining how society treats its most broken members. The jury foreman's hands trembled slightly as he held the verdict form. The weight of Willie Nelson's unexpected performance seemed to hang in the air like Austin's summer humidity, thick, inescapable, and transformative. Jake Morrison sat perfectly still at the defendant's table, his fate balanced on the edge of 12 strangers' collective judgment about justice, mercy, and the possibility of redemption. "On the charge of armed robbery in the first degree," the foreman announced, his voice steady despite the extraordinary circumstances, "we find the defendant guilty as charged." The words hit Jake like a physical blow, though he'd expected them. The facts had never been in dispute. He had committed armed robbery. He had terrorized Pete Kowalski. The guilt was clear, even if the reasons behind it were complex. But the foreman wasn't finished. "However," he continued, his voice growing stronger, "we also submit a unanimous recommendation for the minimum sentence allowable under Texas law, along with a formal request that the court consider alternative sentencing options that would allow the defendant to make meaningful restitution to the victim and the community." A murmur ran through the courtroom like a wave. This wasn't the harsh verdict Robert Harrison had sought, nor was it the complete vindication Sarah Chen had hoped for. It was something else entirely. A nuanced judgment that acknowledged both Jake's guilt and his humanity, both the harm he'd caused and the possibility that he could do better. Judge Patricia Whitman nodded gravely as she accepted the verdict form. In 30 years on the bench, she'd learned to read between the lines of jury recommendations. This wasn't just about punishment. It was about a community wrestling with fundamental questions about justice, mercy, and second chances. "Thank you, members of the jury," Judge Whitman said. "You are dismissed with the court's gratitude for your service. Sentencing will be scheduled for next Friday at 9 a.m., which will give me time to review pre-sentencing reports and consider all the factors involved in this case." As the courtroom began to empty, Willie Nelson approached the rail separating the gallery from the court area. His weathered face carried an expression Jake couldn't quite read. Not satisfaction exactly, but something like quiet approval. "Young man," Willie said, his distinctive voice carrying easily despite the commotion around them, "that song your granddaddy taught you. It's not just about finding your way back to the light. It's about helping other folks find their way too. Don't waste this chance." Jake nodded, too overwhelmed to form coherent words. The country music legend's presence at his trial still felt surreal, like something from a dream or a story someone else might tell. But Willie's words carried the weight of lived experience, of someone who'd seen enough of life to understand both its darkness and its possibilities for grace. Sarah Chen was already thinking ahead to the sentencing hearing, calculating strategies and precedents that might influence Judge Whitman's decision. The jury's recommendation was encouraging but not binding. The judge could still impose the maximum sentence if she believed it served the interests of justice. "What happens now?" Jake asked as the bailiff prepared to escort him back to his cell. "Now we prepare for sentencing," Sarah replied, her voice cautiously optimistic. "The jury's recommendation carries weight, but Judge Whitman will want to see evidence that alternative sentencing would serve both punishment and rehabilitation. We need to show her a concrete plan for how you'd make restitution and contribute to the community." Over the next week, Sarah worked tirelessly to develop a sentencing proposal that would satisfy the court's need for justice, while giving Jake a genuine opportunity for redemption. She consulted with probation officers, community service coordinators, and victim advocacy groups to craft a comprehensive plan that addressed Pete Kowalski's trauma as well as Jake's need for accountability. The proposal that emerged was both creative and demanding. Instead of prison time, Jake would serve 5 years of intensive supervised probation, including 2,000 hours of community service focused on crime prevention and victim support. He would be required to complete anger management and financial planning courses, submit to regular drug and alcohol testing, and maintain steady employment to make restitution payments to Pete Kowalski. Most significantly, the proposal included a music therapy component that would allow Jake to use his musical abilities in service to the community, He would perform at schools, community centers, and rehabilitation facilities, sharing his story and using music to connect with at-risk youth who might be facing their own moments of desperate choice. "It's ambitious," Sarah explained during their final meeting before sentencing. "Judge Whitman will want to see genuine commitment, not just empty promises. This plan would require you to rebuild your entire life while constantly confronting what you did and working to prevent others from making similar mistakes." Jake read through the proposal carefully, understanding that this might be his only alternative to years in prison. The requirements were extensive and would fundamentally reshape his future, but they also offered something he'd thought was lost forever: the possibility of becoming someone his grandfather would be proud of. The night before sentencing, Jake lay on his narrow jail cell bunk, thinking about the path that had brought him to this moment. 3 months ago, he'd been a construction worker and street musician, watching his mother die while feeling powerless to save her. Now he was a convicted felon whose fate depended on a judge's willingness to believe that redemption was possible for someone who'd made such a terrible choice. His mother had visited the day before, her condition noticeably worse, despite the treatments that had cost so much and accomplished so little. The irony was devastating. Jake's crime had been motivated by desperate love for her, but it had ultimately caused her more pain than any medical bill. "I'm proud of how you handled yourself in that courtroom," Linda Morrison had said, her voice weak but determined. "The way you owned up to what you did, the way you talked about Granddaddy's music. That's the son I raised, not the scared boy who made that terrible mistake." "I'm so sorry, Mama," Jake had whispered, his voice breaking. "For everything. For letting you down. For putting you through this. For becoming someone you didn't recognize." "Oh, baby," Linda had replied, pressing her palm against the visiting room's bulletproof glass. "I never stopped recognizing you. Scared and desperate, yes. Making the worst choice of your life, yes. But still, my son underneath all that fear. Still the boy who learned about love and music and doing right from your granddaddy." Those words sustained Jake as he prepared for what might be his final appearance before Judge Whitman. Either she would see the same potential for redemption that his mother still believed in, or she would decide that society's need for punishment outweighed any possibility of rehabilitation. The courthouse was packed for the sentencing hearing. Word of Willie Nelson's unexpected appearance had spread throughout Austin, drawing media attention and curious spectators who wanted to witness the conclusion of what had become a uniquely compelling case. Pete Kowalski was there, looking nervous but determined. Over the past week, he'd met with victim advocates and considered the alternative sentencing proposal. His presence would be crucial. If the man Jake had terrorized could support rehabilitation over pure punishment, Judge Whitman would be more likely to consider mercy. Willie Nelson was conspicuously absent, but his impact on the proceedings lingered like the echo of a well-played song. Several spectators wore shirts bearing his image or lyrics, a reminder that music and humanity had somehow found their way into a sterile legal proceeding and transformed it into something deeper. Judge Whitman called the court to order at exactly 9 a.m., her expression giving no hint of her decision. She'd spent the week reviewing Jake's case file, the jury's recommendation, Sarah Chen's alternative sentencing proposal, and her own 30 years of experience trying to balance justice with mercy. "Before I announce my sentencing decision," Judge Whitman began, "I want to address some of the unusual circumstances that have surrounded this case. Mr. Morrison, in my 3 decades on this bench, I have never presided over a trial where Willie Nelson interrupted jury deliberations to perform a song about redemption. That moment forced all of us, myself included, to think differently about justice, punishment, and the possibility that people can change." Jake felt his chest tighten as the judge spoke. Everything hinged on how she'd interpreted Willie's intervention and his own response to it. However, Judge Whitman continued, sentiment doesn't override law, and music doesn't erase the harm caused by crime. Mr. Kowalski, would you like to address the court before I announce the sentence? Pete Kowalski stood slowly, his weathered hands gripping the rail in front of him. The 60-year-old store owner looked directly at Jake for the first time since the robbery, his expression complex and unreadable. Your Honor, Pete began, his Polish accent more pronounced in the formal courtroom setting. 3 months ago, this young man came into my store and scared me more than I have ever been scared in my life. I thought maybe he would kill me, maybe hurt my family. I cannot sleep good since that night. I cannot trust customers like I used to. Jake felt each word like a knife wound, fresh reminders of the damage he'd caused to a good man who'd never deserved such treatment. But, Pete continued, I also remembered Jake from before that night. Good boy, polite, always asked about his mother. I know he was desperate. I know he was scared. What he did was wrong. Very wrong. But I do not think sending him to prison helps anybody. Not me. Not him. Not his sick mother. Pete paused, gathering his thoughts and courage. If Jake Morrison wants to spend his time helping other people, teaching them music, preventing other crimes, that is better than prison. That helps the community. That honors what happened to me by making sure it doesn't happen to somebody else. The courtroom fell silent as Pete sat down. His willingness to support rehabilitation over retribution carried enormous weight, demonstrating a kind of grace that transcended the usual boundaries of victim and perpetrator. Judge Whitman nodded thoughtfully before addressing Jake directly. Mr. Morrison, please stand. Over the past week, I've reviewed your case extensively. I've considered the jury's recommendation, the alternative sentencing proposal submitted by your attorney, and Mr. Kowalski's remarkably generous statement. I've also thought a great deal about what happened in this courtroom last week. Not just Mr. Nelson's performance, but your response to it and what it revealed about your character. Jake's legs felt unsteady as he rose, his entire future balanced on the judge's next words. The law allows for sentences ranging from probation to 20 years in prison for armed robbery. Judge Whitman continued, the severity of your crime would normally justify significant prison time. However, this case presents unique circumstances that warrant careful consideration of alternatives to incarceration. She paused, looking directly at Jake with an expression that seemed to peer into his soul. Mr. Morrison, I am sentencing you to 5 years of supervised probation under the terms outlined in your attorney's alternative sentencing proposal. With the following modifications, you will complete 2,500 hours of community service, 500 hours more than originally proposed, with specific emphasis on crime prevention and music education programs. You will make full restitution to Mr. Kowalski for both financial losses and counseling expenses. And you will submit quarterly reports to this court documenting your progress and community impact. Jake felt his knees buckle slightly as the words sank in. Probation instead of prison. Community service instead of a cell. A chance to rebuild his life while making amends for his crime. But let me be absolutely clear, Judge Whitman added, her voice stern. This is not a lenient sentence. This is an opportunity to prove that the person Willie Nelson saw in you, the person who sang about redemption and second chances, is real. If you violate any terms of this probation, if you commit any crime, if you fail to meet your obligations to Mr. Kowalski and this community, you will serve the maximum prison sentence allowed by law. Jake nodded vigorously, tears streaming down his face as the full weight of the judge's decision hit him. He'd been given something he'd thought was impossible. A genuine second chance, an opportunity to become the person his grandfather had tried to teach him to be through music and love, and the belief that people could rise above their worst moments. "Your Honor," Jake managed through his tears, "I won't let you down. I won't let Mr. Kowalski down. I won't let my grandfather's memory down. I promise." Judge Whitman's expression softened slightly. "Mr. Morrison, promises are easy to make in moments of gratitude. The real test will come in the months and years ahead, when the cameras are gone and nobody's watching except the people whose lives you've committed to serving. Don't let them down." As the court session concluded and the spectators began filing out, Jake found himself face to face with Pete Kowalski for the first time since the robbery. The store owner's eyes still held traces of the fear Jake had caused, but they also carried something else, a cautious hope that this unprecedented sentence might accomplish something positive. "I am sorry," Jake said simply, the words inadequate but necessary. "For everything. For the fear. For the damage. For becoming someone who could hurt you. I will spend every day of this probation trying to make it right." Pete nodded slowly. "You cannot take back what happened," he said quietly. "But maybe you can prevent it from happening to someone else. Maybe you can teach young people that there are always other choices, even when everything seems hopeless." They shook hands awkwardly, two men connected by trauma, but choosing to believe in the possibility of healing. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. That would take time, if it came at all. But it was a beginning, a tentative first step towards something that might eventually resemble redemption. Sarah Chen stood beside her client as he processed the reality of his sentence. 5 years of intensive probation would be challenging, demanding constant vigilance and genuine commitment to change. But it was also a gift, an opportunity to rebuild his life while contributing to his community, rather than simply serving time in isolation. "Thank you," Jake said to his attorney, his voice thick with emotion, "for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself, for fighting for something better than I deserved." "You deserved a fair hearing and competent representation," Sarah replied. "What you do with this opportunity, that's up to you. But I think your grandfather would be proud of how you handled yourself in that courtroom. That song Willie Nelson recognized? It's still in you, Jake. Don't let it get lost again." As Jake was processed for his release into supervised probation, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. 3 months ago, he'd been a desperate man who'd made a terrible choice in a moment of panic. Now, he was a convicted felon with a chance to rebuild his life through service to others. The path ahead wouldn't be easy. Community service, restitution payments, constant supervision, and the weight of public scrutiny would be daily reminders of his crime and its consequences. But they would also be opportunities to prove that Willie Nelson had been right to recognize something redeemable in a young man humming his grandfather's song about second chances. That afternoon, as Jake walked out of the Travis County Courthouse into Austin's blazing sunshine, he carried with him the memory of music transforming a sterile legal proceeding into something profoundly human. Willie Nelson's unexpected intervention had reminded everyone present that justice without mercy was incomplete, that punishment without hope of redemption served no one. But now came the harder part, proving that the faith placed in him by Judge Whitman, Pete Kowalski, and even Willie Nelson himself was justified. Jake Morrison had been given something rare in the criminal justice system, a genuine second chance. Whether he would make the most of it remained to be seen. The melody his grandfather had taught him so many years ago played in his mind as he walked toward an uncertain but hopeful future. It was a song about redemption, about finding light in darkness, about the possibility that even broken people could contribute something beautiful to the world. Now, It was up to Jake to live that melody, to transform it from memory into reality through years of patient work and constant commitment to becoming better than his worst moment. 2 years after Willie Nelson's unexpected interruption transformed a routine criminal trial into something approaching grace, Jake Morrison stood on the small stage at the East Austin Community Center, tuning his grandfather's guitar as 40 teenagers watched with expressions ranging from skepticism to curiosity. The afternoon sun slanted through tall windows, casting long shadows across the room where Jake had been conducting weekly music therapy sessions as part of his community service requirement. The young faces before him reminded Jake of himself at their age, searching for identity, wrestling with pressures they couldn't always articulate, making choices that would shape their futures in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. Some came from single-parent homes where money was tight and opportunities were scarce. Others were dealing with addiction, family violence, or the kind of desperation that could drive someone to make terrible decisions in moments of crisis. How many of you have ever made a mistake you thought you couldn't come back from? Jake asked, his voice carrying the hard-earned wisdom of someone who'd learned that redemption was possible but never easy. Several hands went up hesitantly. A few kids nodded without raising their hands. Most just stared at him with the guarded expressions of young people who'd learned not to trust adults with their pain. "I made one," Jake continued, settling the guitar more comfortably on his knee. "Made it right here in Austin, about 2 years ago. Cost an innocent man his peace of mind, cost my family their pride in me, cost me almost everything I thought mattered about my life." He began playing the melody Willie Nelson had recognized that day in the courthouse, his grandfather's song about redemption and second chances. The simple chord progression filled the community center with warmth, transforming the institutional space into something more intimate and human. This song was written by a man who'd lost his way, Jake said, his fingers finding the familiar patterns his grandfather had taught him so many years ago. Written by someone who thought he was too broken to be fixed, too far gone to find his way back to the light. But music taught him something important. Taught him that no mistake has to be the end of your story if you're willing to do the work to write a better ending. A girl in the front row, Maria Santos, whose father worked construction and whose mother cleaned offices at night to make ends meet, leaned forward slightly. Jake had been working with Maria for 6 months, watching her channel her anger and frustration into songwriting that was both raw and beautiful. "Mr. Jake," Maria said, using the informal title the kids had adopted for him, "you really robbed somebody? With a gun and everything?" "With a knife," Jake corrected gently. "And yes, I really did. I walked into a store owned by a good man who'd never hurt anybody, and I scared him so badly he still has trouble sleeping. I did it because I thought I was out of options, because I was desperate and afraid and too proud to ask for help. But none of that excuses what I did." He continued playing as he spoke, the melody providing a gentle counterpoint to the harsh realities he was describing. The worst part wasn't getting caught or going to trial or even almost going to prison. The worst part was becoming someone I didn't recognize, someone who could hurt an innocent person because I couldn't figure out how to solve my problems any other way. A boy near the back, David Chen, whose older brother had been arrested for dealing drugs to pay for their grandmother's medication, spoke up. "But you didn't go to prison. You got off easy." Jake's fingers never stopped moving across the guitar strings, but his expression grew more serious. "Easy?" He shook his head. "David, I spend 40 hours a week doing community service. I pay $800 a month to Mr. Kowalski, the man I robbed, to help cover his therapy and the security upgrades he had to make to his store. I meet with a probation officer twice a week, submit to random drug tests, and attend counseling sessions to deal with the depression and anxiety that contributed to my crime. He looked around the room, making eye contact with as many of the teenagers as possible. But most importantly, I carry the weight of what I did every single day. I see Mr. Kowalski's face when he was afraid I might hurt him. I remember my mother crying when she visited me in jail. I think about all the people I let down because I couldn't find the courage to ask for help when I needed it most. The room had grown quiet, the usual restlessness of teenagers replaced by something approaching genuine attention. These kids knew about desperation and impossible choices. They understood the kind of pressure that could drive someone to do things they never thought they were capable of. "So why are you here?" asked Jasmine Williams, a 17-year-old whose mother worked 3 jobs and still struggled to keep their family afloat. "Why not just do your community service somewhere else? Somewhere easier?" Jake smiled, thinking about the question he'd asked himself many times over the past 2 years. The answer had evolved as he'd worked with hundreds of at-risk youth, sharing his story and teaching them to find their voices through music. "Because you remind me of myself," he said simply. "Because I see kids every day who are facing the same kinds of pressures I faced, making the same mistakes I almost made. And maybe, just maybe, if I can help one of you find a better way to handle desperation than I did, then Mr. Kowalski's trauma and my mother's heartbreak might serve some purpose." He transitioned into a different song, one Maria had written about watching her parents work themselves to exhaustion while still falling behind on bills. Her lyrics were raw and honest, capturing the frustration of growing up poor in a city that seemed designed for people with money. "Maria wrote this," Jake explained as he played her melody. "It's about feeling trapped by circumstances you can't control, about watching people you love struggle and feeling powerless to help. Sound familiar?" Several heads nodded around the room. These kids lived those realities every day, watching parents work multiple jobs, seeing siblings drop out of school to help support their families, facing choices between staying in school and earning money their households desperately needed. "Music gave me a way to process those feelings without hurting anybody," Jake continued. "When I was your age, I'd come home from construction work exhausted and angry at a world that seemed unfair. But then I'd pick up my grandfather's guitar, and somehow those feelings would transform into something else. Not happiness exactly, but something more manageable." He began teaching them the chord progression to Maria's song, walking around the room to help kids who'd never held instruments before. Music therapy wasn't just about performance. It was about giving young people tools to understand and express emotions that might otherwise drive them toward destructive choices. "The night I robbed Mr. Kowalski's store," Jake said, as the teenagers practiced their chords, "I had stopped playing music, stopped writing, stopped performing on South Congress, stopped connecting with the part of myself that my grandfather had taught me was most important. When you lose that connection to something larger than your immediate problems, it becomes easier to make terrible choices." After the session ended and the teenagers filed out into Austin's late afternoon heat, Jake packed his guitar with the same careful attention his grandfather had taught him decades earlier. The instrument had been returned to him after his trial, and he'd made playing it a daily practice, not for income anymore, but for the spiritual discipline his grandfather had always insisted music provided. His phone buzzed with a text from his probation officer, reminding him about tomorrow's meeting and the monthly report he needed to submit, documenting his community service hours, restitution payments, and progress in counseling. The administrative aspects of supervised probation were tedious, but necessary reminders that his freedom was conditional, earned through consistent demonstration that he was becoming someone better than his worst moment. Jake's mother had died 8 months after his sentencing, her cancer finally overwhelming the treatments that had cost so much and accomplished so little. Her death had been both devastating and strangely liberating. Devastating because Jake's crime had been motivated by desperate love for her. Liberating because her passing removed the financial pressure that had driven him to robbery in the first place. Linda Morrison's final weeks had been spent in hospice care. Surrounded by family and filled with music, Jake had played guitar by her bedside every evening. The same songs his grandfather had taught him about love and loss and the possibility of redemption. Even as the cancer stole her strength, music had provided comfort that medication couldn't match. "I'm proud of what you're doing," she'd whispered during one of their last conversations. "Granddaddy would be proud too. You took the worst thing you ever did, and you're using it to help other people make better choices. That's what redemption looks like, baby. Not forgetting what you did, but making sure it serves some purpose." Her words had sustained Jake through the grieving process and the ongoing challenges of rebuilding his life under constant scrutiny. Every teenager he worked with, every community service hour he completed, every dollar he paid in restitution was both penance for his crime and tribute to his mother's belief that people could change. Pete Kowalski had surprised everyone by becoming not quite a friend, but something approaching an ally in Jake's rehabilitation efforts. The store owner still struggled with anxiety and sleep problems, still jumped when customers moved too quickly or reached into their pockets unexpectedly. But he'd also developed a grudging respect for Jake's commitment to making amends. They met monthly at a coffee shop near Pete's store, conversations that were initially awkward but had gradually become something more comfortable. Pete would update Jake on his therapy progress and the impact of Jake's restitution payments. Jake would share stories from his community service work and the slow process of rebuilding his reputation in Austin's music community. "You know what helps me sleep better?" Pete had said during one of their recent meetings. "Knowing that you're out there working with kids, teaching them that there are always other choices. Every teenager you reach, every kid who decides not to rob somebody because they heard your story, that makes what happened to me serve some purpose." The relationship between victim and perpetrator had evolved into something neither man could have imagined during the robbery's immediate aftermath. Not friendship exactly, but a shared commitment to ensuring that Jake's crime contributed to preventing similar tragedies rather than simply serving as another statistics in Austin's crime reports. Jake's community service work had expanded beyond the initial requirements outlined in his sentence. He now volunteered at 3 different organizations: the East Austin Community Center, where he conducted music therapy sessions, a financial literacy program for low-income families, and a victim advocacy group where he shared his story with other offenders working toward rehabilitation. The financial literacy work had been particularly meaningful, born from Jake's recognition that his crime had partially stemmed from his inability to navigate complex medical billing and insurance systems. He'd learned to help families understand their options when facing overwhelming debt, to connect them with resources he hadn't known existed during his own crisis. Financial desperation doesn't excuse crime, Jake would tell the families he worked with. But it doesn't have to lead to crime either. There are always alternatives if you're willing to swallow your pride and ask for help. The victim advocacy work was the most challenging aspect of his community service, requiring Jake to confront other offenders with the reality of harm they'd caused, while also modeling the possibility of redemption through service. Many were initially skeptical of advice from someone they viewed as having gotten away with his crime through alternative sentencing. "You think you understand what I'm going through?" A young man named Kevin had challenged during one of Jake's first sessions with recently convicted offenders. "You robbed somebody and got community service. I did the same thing and I'm looking at 5 years in prison." Jake had acknowledged the apparent unfairness while explaining the factors that had influenced Judge Whitman's decision: his lack of prior criminal history, Pete Kowalski's support for alternative sentencing, The comprehensive rehabilitation plan Sarah Chen had developed, and perhaps most importantly, his genuine acceptance of responsibility and commitment to making amends. "I got a second chance that most people don't get," Jake had told Kevin. "And I know that's not fair." But fairness isn't really the point anymore. The question is what you're going to do with whatever chance you get, whenever you get it. Are you going to waste it feeling sorry for yourself? Or are you going to use it to become someone better? Over time, several of the offenders Jake worked with had found their own paths toward redemption, even from prison. They'd started educational programs, developed restitution plans, and committed to community service upon their release. Jake's story had provided hope that criminal convictions didn't have to be the end of their stories if they were willing to do the work of genuine rehabilitation. Willie Nelson's role in Jake's transformation had become something of an Austin legend, retold in newspapers and music magazines as an example of the unexpected ways art could intersect with justice. The country music icon had never publicly discussed his reasons for attending Jake's trial or his decision to interrupt the proceedings with an impromptu performance. But 6 months after Jake's sentencing, Willie had shown up at one of his community center sessions, guitar in hand, and ready to play with the teenagers who'd heard the story, but never quite believed it was real. His presence had electrified the kids and reminded Jake that his second chance had been made possible by someone else's willingness to see beyond his worst moment. "Music saved my life more than once," Willie had told the gathered teenagers, his weathered fingers finding familiar chords on his battered guitar. "Sometimes it saves you slowly, through years of finding better ways to handle pain and pressure. Sometimes it saves you all at once, in a moment, when the right song reminds everybody in the room that we're all human beings trying to figure out how to love each other despite our mistakes." The session had ended with 40 teenagers, 2 ex-convicts, and a country music legend performing Jake's grandfather's redemption song together, their voices blending into something that transcended their individual stories of struggle and hope. It was a moment Jake would remember for the rest of his life, a reminder that music could indeed tell truths when words weren't sufficient. Now, 2 years into his probation, Jake had developed a routine that balanced his various obligations with a growing sense of purpose he'd never experienced before his crime. Mornings were usually spent at construction sites, working for a company that specialized in building low-income housing. Honest work that paid decent money and contributed to his community's well-being. Afternoons were devoted to community service, music therapy, financial literacy education, victim advocacy work, and occasional speaking engagements at schools and community organizations. Evenings were his own, usually spent writing songs, practicing guitar, and slowly rebuilding relationships with family and friends who'd been hurt by his actions. The restitution payments to Pete Kowalski would continue for another 18 months, a monthly reminder of the ongoing cost of his crime. But they'd also become something more positive, evidence of his commitment to accountability and his ability to maintain steady employment despite his criminal record. His relationship with Sarah Chen had evolved from attorney-client to something approaching friendship, built on shared investment in criminal justice reform and alternative sentencing programs. She'd used Jake's case as a model for other clients facing similar circumstances, demonstrating that rehabilitation and community service could be more effective than incarceration for certain offenders. "You've become my best advertisement for alternative sentencing," Sarah had told Jake during a recent coffee meeting. "Every time a prosecutor argues that probation is too lenient for armed robbery, I show them your community service records and victim impact statements. You've proven that punishment and redemption don't have to be mutually exclusive." Jake's story had also attracted attention from criminology researchers studying the effectiveness of restorative justice programs. He'd participated in several academic studies examining factors that contributed to successful rehabilitation, sharing his experiences with scholars who were working to develop more effective approaches to criminal justice. The research had revealed patterns Jake recognized from his own experience: the importance of accepting responsibility rather than making excuses, the need for concrete plans to make amends to victims and communities, the value of ongoing support systems that reinforced positive choices rather than simply monitoring for violations. Traditional incarceration often fails because it removes offenders from their communities without addressing the underlying issues that contributed to their crimes. One researcher had explained to Jake, "Your case demonstrates that carefully structured community-based sentences can be more effective at preventing recidivism while also providing direct benefits to victims and society." But Jake understood that his success story was still incomplete. Dependent on years of continued good choices and consistent commitment to the values his grandfather had tried to teach him through music. Probation violations, even minor ones, could still result in prison time. More importantly, the teenagers he worked with were counting on him to prove that people could change, that mistakes didn't have to define someone forever. As Jake drove home through Austin's evening traffic, past the South Congress Bridge, where he'd once played guitar for tourists and locals alike, he thought about the strange journey that had brought him from desperate criminal to community advocate. The path hadn't been easy. 2 years of intensive supervision, constant scrutiny, and daily confrontation with the consequences of his actions. But it had also been transformative in ways he couldn't have imagined when Judge Whitman had announced his sentence. Working with at-risk youth had taught him that his own struggles weren't unique, that many people faced impossible choices between survival and morality. The difference was finding support systems and coping mechanisms before desperation drove you to hurt others. His grandfather's song about redemption played on his truck's radio as Jake pulled into the parking lot of his modest apartment complex. The melody was the same one Willie Nelson had recognized in a courthouse 2 years earlier. The same tune that had somehow transformed a criminal trial into a moment of grace and possibility. But now, the song carried new meanings, accumulated through hundreds of hours of community service and countless conversations with teenagers who reminded him of his younger self. It wasn't just about personal redemption anymore. It was about using your worst moments to prevent others from making similar mistakes, about transforming personal failure into community healing. Jake's phone buzzed with a text from Maria Santos, the teenager from his afternoon session. "Mr. Jake," the message read, "I wrote a new song about second chances. Can you help me with the chords tomorrow?" He smiled as he typed his response, thinking about the invisible threads that connected his grandfather's front porch lessons to Willie Nelson's courthouse performance to a 17-year-old girl discovering her own voice through music. Redemption wasn't a destination you arrived at. It was a daily choice to use your experience, even your failures, in service to something larger than yourself. 3 more years of probation lay ahead. 3 more years of proving that Judge Whitman's faith in alternative sentencing had been justified. But Jake no longer thought of probation as punishment he was enduring. He thought of it as opportunity he was grateful to have received. A chance to transform his worst moment into his most meaningful work. As he climbed the stairs to his apartment, Jake hummed his grandfather's melody and thought about tomorrow's session with the teenagers at the community center. There would be new kids dealing with familiar pressures, young people facing choices that could define their futures for better or worse. And he would be there with his guitar and his story, living proof that no mistake had to be the end of someone's story if they were willing to do the hard work of writing a better ending. The song would continue, passed from his grandfather to him, from him to Maria and David and Jasmine and dozens of other young people who needed to hear that redemption was possible. It was a melody about second chances and the possibility of grace, played one note at a time by imperfect people trying to find their way back to the light. Willie Nelson had been right that day in the courthouse. The song wasn't just about finding your own way back to the light. It was about helping others find their way too. And in the serving, in the daily choice to turn personal failure into community healing, Jake Morrison had discovered something he'd never expected. That redemption wasn't just about being forgiven for your worst moment, but about using that moment to become someone capable of offering grace to others struggling with their own darkness. The melody played on, carried by new voices in each generation, telling the eternal human story of falling down and getting back up, of making mistakes and learning to do better, of finding hope in hopeless places and sharing that hope with anyone brave enough to listen. Epilogue, 5 years later. The Travis County Courthouse looked exactly the same as Jake Morrison walked through its marble corridors 5 years after Willie Nelson had transformed his criminal trial into something approaching grace. But Jake himself was fundamentally different. No longer a desperate young man facing prison time, but a 33-year-old community advocate whose work with at-risk youth had earned recognition throughout Austin and beyond. Today marked the official conclusion of his probation term. Judge Patricia Whitman, now nearing retirement, had scheduled a brief hearing to formally release Jake from supervised probation and close the case that had become one of the most unusual in her 3 decades on the bench. The courtroom was sparsely populated compared to the packed galleries during Jake's original trial and sentencing. Sarah Chen sat in the front row, her hair now streaked with silver, but her expression still carrying the passionate commitment to justice that had made her such an effective advocate for alternative sentencing. Pete Kowalski was there too, his presence a testament to the unlikely relationship that had developed between victim and perpetrator over 5 years of monthly meetings and shared commitment to preventing similar crimes. Several of the teenagers Jake had worked with during his probation filled the back rows. Maria Santos, now a college junior studying social work, David Chen, who'd started a nonprofit organization providing music therapy to incarcerated youth, Jasmine Williams, who'd earned a full scholarship to UT's business school and planned to focus on financial literacy education for underserved communities. Judge Whitman called the court to order with the same dignity that had characterized her handling of Jake's original case. The years had added lines around her eyes and gray to her hair, but her voice still carried the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that shaped lives and communities. "Mr. Morrison," she began, "5 years ago, I sentenced you to supervised probation in lieu of prison time. That decision was based on my belief that rehabilitation and community service could be more effective than incarceration in your particular case. Today, I'm here to evaluate whether that belief was justified." Jake stood as he had 5 years earlier, but without the fear and desperation that had characterized his original appearance. He wore a simple navy suit, not the ill-fitting borrowed clothes of his trial, but something he'd purchased with money earned through honest work and careful budgeting. "Your probation officer reports that you have completed 2,147 hours of community service, 347 hours beyond your original requirement," Judge Whitman continued, reading from the file that documented 5 years of Jake's rehabilitation efforts. "You have maintained steady employment, completed all required counseling and education programs, and made full restitution to Mr. Kowalski 18 months ahead of schedule." The numbers told only part of Jake's story over the past 5 years. The community service hours represented hundreds of music therapy sessions with at-risk youth, financial literacy workshops for struggling families, speaking engagements at schools and community organizations, and volunteer work with victim advocacy groups. but they didn't capture the relationships he'd built, the lives he'd influenced, or the ways his own perspective had been transformed through service to others. More significantly, Judge Whitman added, your community service work has expanded far beyond your original requirements. I understand you now serve on the board of directors for 3 nonprofit organizations and have been instrumental in developing music therapy programs that have been adopted by communities throughout Texas. Jake nodded, thinking about the improbable journey that had led from his desperate crime to meaningful work helping others avoid similar mistakes. The board positions had come gradually, recognition of his expertise in working with at-risk youth, and his unique perspective as someone who'd successfully navigated the path from criminal conviction to community leadership. Mr. Kowalski, Judge Whitman said, addressing the man whose life had been forever changed by Jake's moment of desperation, you've been remarkably generous in your support for Mr. Morrison's rehabilitation efforts. Would you like to address the court before I formally conclude his probation? Pete stood slowly, his 65-year-old frame showing the wear of decades of hard work and the psychological toll of being victimized by someone he'd considered a friend. But his expression carried none of the fear and anger that had characterized his original testimony. Time and Jake's consistent efforts at making amends had created something that approached healing, if not complete forgiveness. Your Honor, Pete began, his Polish accent still coloring his words after nearly 40 years in America. 5 years ago, Jake Morrison scared me more than I have ever been scared. He took my sense of safety, made me question whether I could trust the customers who had been coming to my store for years. Jake felt the familiar weight of guilt as Pete spoke, a reminder that some damage could be addressed, but never completely undone. The trauma Pete had experienced would always be part of his story, regardless of how much good Jake had done in the years since. But I also want to tell the court what Jake has done since that night, Pete continued. He has paid me every dollar he owed, helped me understand the desperation that drove his crime, and most importantly, spent 5 years working to make sure other young people don't make the same mistake he made. Pete turned to look directly at Jake, his expression complex but not unkind. I still have bad dreams sometimes. I still get nervous when customers reach into their pockets quickly. But I also sleep better knowing that Jake is out there working with kids, teaching them that there are always other choices, even when everything seems hopeless. The courtroom was absolutely silent as Pete sat down. His words carried enormous weight, demonstrating the kind of grace that transcended traditional notions of justice and punishment. Here was a man who'd been genuinely traumatized by crime, choosing to support his victimizer's rehabilitation because he believed it served a greater purpose. Judge Whitman nodded thoughtfully before addressing Jake directly. Mr. Morrison, when I sentenced you 5 years ago, I took a considerable risk. Alternative sentencing for armed robbery is unusual, and my decision was influenced by extraordinary circumstances, including Willie Nelson's unexpected intervention and your apparent genuine remorse for your actions. She paused, looking at the file that documented 5 years of Jake's life under court supervision. That risk appears to have been justified. You have not only met every requirement of your probation, you have exceeded them. You have transformed your crime from a simple case of theft into a foundation for meaningful service to your community. Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion as Judge Whitman continued. However, I want to be clear about something. Your success over the past 5 years doesn't erase what you did to Mr. Kowalski. It doesn't eliminate the fear you caused or the trust you violated. What it does demonstrate is that people can change, that criminals can become contributors, and that our justice system occasionally has the wisdom to prioritize rehabilitation over pure punishment. The judge's final words echoed through the courtroom, with the weight of institutional recognition that Jake's case had implications beyond his individual story. His success had become evidence that alternative sentencing could work when combined with genuine accountability and comprehensive support systems. Mr. Morrison, I hereby release you from supervised probation effective immediately. Your obligations to this court are complete. However, I suspect your obligations to your community will continue for the rest of your life. Not because they are imposed by law, but because they have become part of who you are. Jake felt tears streaming down his face as the reality of complete freedom settled over him. No more monthly meetings with probation officers, no more mandatory drug tests or community service requirements, no more constant supervision and scrutiny of his daily choices. But Judge Whitman was right. His work with at-risk youth and crime prevention had become central to his identity rather than simply a legal obligation. The teenagers who looked to him for guidance, the families who sought his help with financial literacy, the communities that benefited from his victim advocacy work. These relationships had become the most meaningful aspects of his life. Thank you, Your Honor, Jake managed through his tears, for giving me a chance to prove that people can change, that mistakes don't have to define us forever. I won't forget the faith you placed in me, and I won't stop working to justify it. After the brief hearing concluded, Jake found himself surrounded by the people who'd supported his rehabilitation over the past 5 years. Sarah Chen hugged him with the fierce pride of someone who'd fought for justice and seen it ultimately prevail. Pete Kowalski shook his hand awkwardly. Their relationship still complicated, but genuine in its commitment to preventing similar tragedies. The teenagers who'd driven from their respective colleges and jobs to witness Jake's release from probation gathered around him with the exuberance of young people celebrating their mentor's success. Maria Santos, now studying to become a therapist specializing in trauma recovery, had tears in her eyes as she congratulated Jake on officially completing his sentence. "You saved my life," she told him quietly, her words carrying the weight of someone who'd narrowly avoided making the same desperate choices that had led to Jake's crime. Not from robbery or anything like that, but from giving up on myself when everything seemed impossible. You showed me that mistakes don't have to be the end of your story. David Chen, whose music nonprofit had grown to serve youth in 6 Texas cities, was already planning expanded collaboration with Jake's work. "We need to take this statewide," he said excitedly. "Other communities need to hear your story, need to understand that alternative sentencing can work when it's done right." Jasmine Williams, who'd overcome her own family's financial struggles to earn a business degree, spoke about the impact of Jake's financial literacy workshops. "My mama still uses the budgeting techniques you taught her," she said. "Says they saved our family from losing our house when she got laid off last year." As the group filed out of the courthouse into Austin's afternoon sunshine, Jake thought about the improbable journey that had brought him from desperate criminal to community leader. 5 years earlier, he'd stood in the same courthouse facing the possibility of decades in prison. Now he was walking out completely free, surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by his efforts at redemption. The path hadn't been easy. 5 years of intensive supervision, constant scrutiny, and daily confrontation with the consequences of his actions had been challenging in ways he'd never anticipated. But they had also been transformative, teaching him that genuine accountability required more than simply serving time. It required using your worst moments in service to preventing others from making similar mistakes. Willie Nelson hadn't attended the hearing, but his influence on Jake's story remained profound. The country music legend's recognition of redemption's possibility in a desperate young man's humming had changed the trajectory of multiple lives. Not just Jake's, but also the teenagers he'd worked with, the families he'd counseled, and the communities that had benefited from programs developed through his rehabilitation efforts. That evening, Jake performed at a benefit concert for the East Austin Community Center, sharing the stage with several musicians who'd heard his story and wanted to support his work with at-risk youth. His guitar playing had improved significantly over 5 years of daily practice. But more importantly, his understanding of music's power to heal and connect had deepened through hundreds of therapy sessions with young people facing their own moments of crisis. As Jake played his grandfather's redemption song for an audience that included many of the teenagers he'd worked with over the years, he thought about the invisible threads connecting past and present, failure and recovery, individual struggle and community healing. The melody was the same one Willie Nelson had recognized in a courthouse 5 years earlier, but its meaning had evolved through experience and service. The song was no longer just about personal redemption. It had become about collective healing, about communities choosing to believe that people could change and deserving support in that transformation. Each verse told stories of second chances and hard-won wisdom, of mistakes transformed into lessons that could benefit others facing similar crossroads. After the concert, as Jake packed his grandfather's guitar with the same careful attention he'd learned as a child, he thought about the future that stretched ahead without court supervision or mandatory community service. He was free to choose his own path for the first time since his crime, but that freedom felt less like liberation than like responsibility. The teenagers who looked to him for guidance, the organizations that depended on his expertise, the communities that had invested in his rehabilitation, they all represented ongoing obligations that transcended legal requirements. Jake had discovered that redemption wasn't a destination you reached, but a daily choice to use your experience, even your failures, in service to something larger than yourself. His phone buzzed with a text from a high school counselor asking if Jake could speak to students about decision-making and consequences. Another message came from a family asking for help navigating medical bills that threatened to overwhelm their budget. A third was from a young man recently released from prison, seeking guidance on rebuilding his life after incarceration. Jake smiled as he responded to each message, scheduling meetings and making commitments that would fill his calendar for weeks to come. This was what freedom looked like after redemption. Not the absence of obligation, but the presence of meaningful purpose that had grown from his worst moment into his most important work. As he drove home through Austin's evening traffic, Jake thought about his mother, who'd died believing that people could change and that her son's mistake might ultimately serve some larger purpose. He thought about his grandfather, whose lessons about music and redemption had somehow survived even Jake's darkest moment and emerged stronger through years of service to others. Most of all, he thought about the ongoing nature of redemption, the way it required constant choice rather than single dramatic transformation. Every day brought opportunities to prove that second chances were worth giving, that communities could be healed through individual commitment to accountability and service. Willie Nelson's courthouse performance had lasted only a few minutes, but its impact continued to ripple through lives and communities years later. Jake's rehabilitation had inspired policy changes in alternative sentencing, influenced research on restorative justice, and, most importantly, prevented countless young people from making the same desperate choices that had once defined his own story. The melody played on, carried by new voices in each generation, telling the eternal human story of falling down and getting back up, of making mistakes and learning to do better, of finding hope in hopeless places and sharing that hope with anyone brave enough to listen. Jake Morrison was finally free from court supervision, but he would never be free from the responsibility his crime had created, the obligation to ensure that his worst moment served some redemptive purpose, that Pete Kowalski's trauma had meaning beyond mere victimization, that communities could choose healing over pure punishment when circumstances warranted grace. The song would continue, note by note, life by life, mistake by mistake, transformed into wisdom, that could guide others away from similar darkness. It was a melody about redemption and second chances, played by imperfect people doing their best to prove that no one was beyond saving if they were willing to do the hard work of genuine change. And in Austin, Texas, where music had always been more than entertainment, where it was community, healing, and hope made audible, Jake Morrison's story became part of a larger symphony about the possibility of grace, the power of accountability, and the endless human capacity for transformation through service to others. The courthouse doors closed behind him for the final time, but the melody continued, carried forward by everyone whose life had been touched by the improbable intersection of crime and redemption, desperation and hope, individual failure and collective healing that had transformed a routine criminal case into something approaching grace.